When a firestorm and freezing rain swept through every farm in the valley, only a single chimney remained, spewing warm smoke into the frigid sky. It belonged to a log cabin everyone considered a madman's fuel-burning structure. A log cabin buried under thousands of pounds of intertwined reeds, plastered with ash and animal fat. Now, as the town's wealthiest farmers huddle in the frozen ruins at -30 degrees, they are forced to crawl through 1.2 meters of snow to reach the very house they once tried to condemn. 3 months before the northern skies turned a chilling iron, the Blackwood Valley in Montana was enjoying the final, seemingly peaceful weeks of September 1889. Throughout the basin, men were busy with the meticulous, age-old preparations for survival on the frontier. The sound of axes echoed through the rusting pine trees. Horse-drawn wagons creaked under the weight of freshly split pine logs piled shoulder-high against house walls. Cellars were filled with potatoes, salted pork, and dried beans. In a land where winter not only visited but occupied all 5 months, every warm hour was precious and could not be wasted. However, on the eastern edge of the valley, 34-year-old Clara Vance spends her precious days doing something that leaves the entire valley shaking their heads in disbelief. 4 months had passed since a white pine tree fell and killed her husband Samuel, leaving Clara alone on the 160-acre rocky estate with her 8-year-old son, Oliver. Samuel was a skilled carpenter, but he died before he could complete the house of his dreams. The log cabin was quite sturdy, built from hand-carved pine logs, but it sat on a barren promontory where the northerly winds from the high mountains blew relentlessly. More importantly, the farm was situated on the Blackwood Basin's only year-round freshwater aqueduct, a crystal-clear stream that never froze, even during the harshest cold spells. That spring was the reason Gideon Sterling parked his gleaming black carriage by Clara's fence almost every Tuesday afternoon. Gideon, 52, a man in a tailored wool suit and a heavy silver watch chain, looked out of place amidst the dust of this land. He owned a sawmill in the valley, a land office in town, and held mortgages on half of the small plots of land along Blackwood Creek. He cared neither for the log cabin nor for the widow's distress. He wanted the creek. Once the water was under his control, he could dictate terms to every rancher from the foothills to the riverbank. "You're a woman living alone, Clara," Gideon said on a chilly afternoon, resting his gloved hands on the ends of his nickel-plated cane. His horse stamped its hooves on the hardening ground. "You can't chop enough wood to keep the boy warm when it gets cold. Sell me that land for $300 in cash. Take Oliver east to your sister in Ohio before the mountain passes freeze over." Clara worked tirelessly. She knelt near the porch, using a blunt knife to strip bark from the trees on the fence. Her hands were calloused, her linen apron stained with dirt, but her gray eyes remained steadfast as she looked up at the speculator. "Samuel built this place for us, Mr. Sterling," she replied, her voice soft, carrying the firm conviction of someone who had weathered the harshest trials of life. "This land still belongs to his son." Gideon smiled, though his eyes remained as cold as winter ice. "Pride is just a thin blanket when temperatures drop to -30 degrees, Mrs. Vance. Let's see what the ice will say about your resolve." Instead of felling trees like the other settlers, Clara used her wood-pulling cart to descend into the treacherous black swamp, a 5-acre stagnant marshland that most settlers avoided because of its deep mud and swarms of mosquitoes. While the entire valley watched with amusement, Clara waded into the dark water, a curved sickle in hand. Her 8-year-old son Oliver worked right beside his mother. Small for his age, he was quick and tireless. While his mother cut the thick, stiff stems of the wild dandelion, reeds that grew up to 8 feet tall in the swamp, Oliver gathered the heavy bundles, dragging them to dry ground with a length of braided hemp rope. Watching them both was Shadow, a large black and brown raccoon dog with scarred ears and a gray muzzle. The old dog sat on a dry basalt outcrop at the edge of the swamp, its ears twitching with every gentle breeze, its dark eyes never leaving the boy. Day after day, Clara laboriously hauled tons of green reeds up the long slope leading to her farm. By the end of the second week, her yard looked more like a reed-cutting shed than a farm. She spread the reed stalks in neat rows on the grass to dry in the late afternoon sun. When the pale green turned a crisp, yellowish hue, she began the real work. Using coarse fibers spun from wild flax, Clara wove the dried stalks into thick, sturdy mats nearly 15 inches thick and 6 feet long. With Oliver's help holding the posts, she began fastening these heavy reed mats directly to the exterior wooden walls of the house. She started with the foundation logs, securing them with hemp rope, and moved up towards the eaves until the exposed wooden beams of Samuel's house were completely obscured by a layer of golden fiber. Before long, rumors spread to the sawmills, blacksmith shops, and taverns in town. They called her the Swamp Widow. They mocked the crazy woman who was building a huge bird's nest around her house. One morning, Major Harrison rode up the slope to investigate the commotion himself. Harrison, then 48 years old, was a retired Army logistics engineer who had built himself a two-story house in the middle of the valley. His house was a marvel of the countryside, constructed of double-jointed pine planks, anchored with iron bolts, and built according to military guidelines for cold-weather housing. Harrison reined in his thoroughbred horse and looked at Clara's work with a mixture of pity and contempt for the profession. "Mrs. Vance," the major called out, adjusting his sturdy leather gloves. "I've served 3 winters at Fort Benton. I know wood and I know the wind. What you're doing there isn't insulation, it's a rodent paradise. Every vole within 10 miles will be nesting in that weed before November. Worse still, it's a powder keg. A single stray spark from your chimney could ignite that pile of dry rubbish and burn you and your son alive in your bed." Clara paused, holding a heavy wooden needle she was using to sew together a piece of fabric. Oliver stood near her feet, his hands stained with brown mud, his small face etched with the same stubborn wrinkles as his mother's. "The air inside the tree trunk isn't moving, Major," Clara said simply, her voice still calm. "And the weeds won't burn once I've dealt with them." Harrison let out a short, hoarse laugh, like a bark. "Air in the weeds? Mrs. Vance, wood and iron are what protect against winter storms, not swamp rubbish." He shook his head, straightened up, and looked down at her one last time. "When the first real north wind hits this valley, you'll be begging Gideon Sterling for a carriage ticket." He left, abandoning the widow to her work. But Gideon Sterling didn't want to wait until winter to resolve the issue. 3 days later, a notice was posted on the door of the district court in Blackwood. Gideon had filed an emergency petition with the territorial judge, claiming that Clara Vance had lost her mind from grief over her husband's death. He argued that she was leaving a minor child in unsafe, unsanitary conditions by turning her home into a rotting swamp, creating a fire hazard for the surrounding properties. The petition sought to declare her an unfit mother, place Oliver in a state orphanage, and appoint a guardian, specifically Gideon Sterling, to oversee the property until the land could be sold. The judge was expected to arrive from the territorial capital in 3 weeks, on the last carriage before the mountain passes froze over. Clara knew she didn't have much time. If her house looked unsafe or unfinished when the police arrived, Gideon Sterling would take Oliver away, and the land would be lost. That night, as the biting autumn frost blanketed the valley's grass in silver, an uninvited guest stepped onto the narrow path leading to Clara's house. His name was Chen. He was 65, a frail-looking man with hands calloused like dry cedar bark. 30 years earlier, Chen had come to Montana to work as a construction worker on the Transcontinental Railroad, digging granite tunnels through the mountains. When the tracks deteriorated, he didn't return to the coast. He built a small underground cellar near the edge of the Black Swamp, living quietly on the edge of a valley almost unnoticed. Chen carried a heavy wooden bucket in each hand, dangling from a notched yoke across his thin shoulders. The hunting dog, Old Shadow, did not bark when the old man approached. Instead, it trotted forward and placed its gray muzzle on Chen's knees. "The townspeople say a lot of nonsense, Mrs. Vance," Mr. Chen said, his voice soft and hoarse, carrying the gentle accent of his native Cantonese, blended with decades of solitary life in the mountains. "They look at your reeds and see only weeds. They don't understand the breath of the earth." Clara wiped her hands on her apron and stepped down from the porch. "Major Harrison said they'll burp and burst into flames with just a small spark." Chen gave a faint, fleeting smile before setting the buckets down on the ground. "The major knows how to train soldiers, but he doesn't know how plants cope with winter. The trunk of a Bodhi tree isn't solid wood. Inside its bark are thousands of tiny cavities, air trapped within the stone cells. Still air is the largest blanket the sky has ever created. The cold cannot reach where the air cannot move." He reached into one of his buckets and pulled out a handful of a thick, dark, greasy mixture with a faint smell of pine charcoal, wood ash, and refined beef fat. Back home, along the northern rivers where the ice is 6 feet thick, we don't leave the reeds exposed to the wind, Chen explained, kneeling beside the gleaming golden reed wall Clara had tied to her house. The reeds hold the air, but the wind will eventually blow them apart. You have to seal the outer layer. He demonstrated an ancient technique that has preserved houses along Asia's icy steppes for 3,000 years. He mixed fine wood ash, rich in natural silica, with coarse rock salt, dried river clay, and refined animal fat. When brushed onto the outer surface of linden mats, the mixture penetrates the outer fibers. The salt draws moisture from the air to dry the ash, while the animal fat creates a flexible, waterproof film that doesn't crack at sub-zero temperatures. More importantly, the high silica content in the wood ash transformed the outer layer into a dense, fire-resistant crust. For 4 nights in a row, under the yellow light of 2 oil lamps, Clara, Oliver, and old Mr. Chen toiled in the cold darkness. They plastered thick, dark mortar onto every inch of the reed walls. Oliver's task was to use small wooden paddles to scrape excess mortar from the buckets, while Chen and his mother kneaded the mortar deep into the interwoven reed fibers. By the end of the week, Clara's farm no longer resembled a wooden hut or a bird's nest. It had transformed into a smooth, dark, seamless block of rock, seemingly rising straight up from the rocky mountain soil. Golden reeds were completely encased within a thick, hard, slate-gray shell, nearly 15 inches thick. Gideon Sterling heard about the grim transformation of the Vance family's log cabin, and he knew that the day of the trial was drawing near. He couldn't let the court see a completed, weather-resistant structure. Past midnight on the second Tuesday of October, the sky was pitch black, heavy with the smell of an impending rain. 2 men crept stealthily up the tree-shaded slope behind Clara's barn. They were rough laborers from Sterling's sawmill, carrying a can of kerosene and a torch wrapped in rags. Their instructions were simple: set fire to the widow's outer wall, let the hay catch, then flee. The incident would be recorded as a tragic chimney accident, sure proof that the swamp widow's insane project was the deadly trap Sterling had warned everyone about. The men silently approached the north wall. One opened a bottle and poured a thick layer of kerosene onto the dark, plastered surface. The second struck a match on his trousers, touched it to a rag, and then held a burning torch directly against the wall. He expected a firestorm. He expected the dry reeds below to roar like a bonfire. Instead, something strange happened. The kerosene flared up in a brief, brilliant yellow flash, burning away the oil on the surface in seconds. But when the liquid fuel burned out, the wall did not catch fire. The grease and ash did not ignite. Under the intense heat of the torch, the silica in the ash and mineral salts vitrified, combining to form a hard, glass-like black glaze. The reeds beneath remained completely unharmed. The torch fell onto the wet grass and went out with a faint hissing sound. Inside, Old Shadow let out a deep, resounding roar. Clara sprang from bed instantly. She snatched Samuel's double-barreled shotgun from behind the door, pulled both triggers back with a resounding metallic clang, and then flung the bedroom window open into the darkness. "Anyone who steps on this grass and goes home in a box will die," she shrieked into the rain, her voice echoing across the dark, pine-covered hillside. The 2 sawmill workers stared in utter horror at the blackened, unburned wall, then at the gleaming barrel of a pistol in the window. "She's a witch!" one of them yelled, throwing the kerosene can down into the mud. "This damn house just won't burn!" They turned and dashed down the trail, disappearing into the dark, dense forest as quickly as they could. As dawn broke, Clara stood outside observing the north wall. Where the torchlight shone, it was dark and hard as slate, yet the structure remained intact. But as she stood there, Shadow slowly walked along the foundation, his nose pressed against the lower edge of the plaster. The old dog stopped near the northwest corner, whimpered softly, and began scratching the ground. Clara knelt down beside the dog. She placed her bare hand near the base of the wooden floorboards. There were no visible holes, but she could feel a weak, steady stream of icy air being drawn in from beneath the floorboards. "The wind always finds the smallest gap, Mrs. Vance," Chen said as he stepped onto the trail, carrying a basket full of dried juniper berries and pine resin. "A wall may be 4 feet thick, but if the air doesn't circulate underneath, the cold will corrode your house from the bottom up." Together, Clara and Chen dug a shallow trench along the entire outer perimeter of the house's foundation. They filled the space beneath the bottom logs with a thick mixture of crushed charcoal, dried moss, and mineral mortar, sealing every tiny crack where the earth came into contact with the wood. When completed, the entire cabin is enclosed, from the roof and sides to the bottom, in an airtight, soundproof shell. 5 days later, the district magistrate arrived in Blackwood by morning carriage. Gideon Sterling sat in the front row of the courtroom, wearing his finest black coat, surrounded by 3 lawyers from the Capitol. Major Harrison sat nearby, preparing to give expert technical testimony concerning the fire hazard of the swamp vegetation. When Clara entered the courtroom, she didn't look like a woman who had lost her mind. She wore a clean woolen dress, her hair neatly tied back, and carried a small leather-bound notebook. Oliver sat quietly beside her, his patched but clean coat, his face healthy and radiant. "Mr. Sterling claims your home is a fire hazard and not a suitable shelter for children, Ms. Vance," the judge said, bending over his glasses as he reviewed the complaint. "Major Harrison here asserts that your construction methods are dangerous and not up to standard." Clara walked over and placed her accounting books on the judge's desk. "Your Honor, Major Harrison never set foot in my house," Clara said clearly, her voice echoing through the quiet courtroom. "And Mr. Sterling's men tried to burn down the north wall of my house with kerosene 3 nights ago. The fire went out. The wall is still standing. In this notebook, I have recorded the morning and evening temperatures inside my house for the past 30 days, along with the amount of firewood consumed. My house uses only 1/3 the amount of firewood that Major Harrison burned, and the temperature never dropped below 65 degrees. The judge opened the ledger. Each page was neatly and accurately recorded in Clara's clear handwriting. Next to the numbers were small technical diagrams showing the wall layers, air channels, and the mineral composition of the exterior plaster. The judge lifted his head from his book, glanced at Major Harrison's flushed face, then at Gideon Sterling, who was sweating beneath his high linen collar. "The lawsuit is dismissed," the judge declared, slamming his gavel down on the ground with a sharp crack. "This court does not seize property on the ignorance of a neighbor. Have a good day, gentlemen." November arrived in the Blackwood Valley not with gentle autumn rains, but with a strange, oppressive stillness that seemed to trap the entire basin under a heavy, leaden dome. The barometer hanging on the wall of the town's land office dropped to a level not seen anywhere else in the region. Old Mr. Chen emerged from the swamp, carrying a bundle of dried roots. He stood near Clara's porch and pointed toward the dark, murky water of the swamp. "The ground is freezing up from the bottom, Mrs. Vance," Chen said softly, his eyes fixed on the northern horizon, where the mountain peaks had completely disappeared behind a gray mist. "When the ground freezes up before the frost even reaches the grass, it means a severe cold spell is coming, a relentless one." In the town of Blackwood, the inhabitants paid little attention to atmospheric pressure or the mud in the swamps. Major Harrison was busy putting the finishing touches on his imposing 2-story pine log house, boasting at the pub that its thick planks and iron-reinforced roof could withstand a blizzard more severe than any other house in the area. Gideon Sterling, meanwhile, was busy finalizing winter credit terms for small farmers, charging exorbitant interest rates on truckloads of coal and hay. Then, on the afternoon of November 14th, the weather delivered its first terrifying surprise. It didn't begin with snow. It began with an unseasonal dry electrical storm that swept across the plain before the cold air mass arrived. Long, sharp, white lightning bolts struck the dry, sun-scorched grass along the western slopes. Fueled by 40-mile-an-hour winds, a wall of fire erupted across the prairie in minutes, spreading rapidly through the valley like a river of liquid fire. The entire town immediately descended into panic. Farmers scrambled to create fire breaks, but the grass was parched after months of drought. The flames spread straight toward the central basin, burning down wooden fences, haystacks, and outbuildings along the way. Major Harrison's imposing farm lay directly in the path of the flames. The wind howled, whipping the smoldering embers from the front of the main fire onto the exposed pine board roof and the large piles of wood he had stacked against the north wall. Within 20 minutes, the roof of the military fort Harrison had built was engulfed in flames. Farm laborers rushed, scooping water from the deep well and pouring hundreds of gallons onto the smoking rafters in a desperate attempt to save the structure. A mile to the east, the wall of fire roared toward Clara Vance's house. Gideon Sterling sat in his carriage on the main road, binoculars pressed against his eyes. "The widow's home in the swamp has fallen," he muttered to his driver, a sinister smile playing on his lips. "Those haystacks will burn like gunpowder." Inside the log cabin, Clara held Oliver tightly while Old Shadow stood by the door, baring his teeth as he watched the blazing red light roar through the window pane. The sound was like a freight train hurtling through a haystack, a deafening roar, crackling and filling the sky with thick black smoke and sparks. The fire flared up at the outer edge of Clara's property. It consumed the dry grass in the meadow, spread rapidly across the dirt yard, and slammed into the dark, reed-covered walls of the wooden house. The flames rose nearly 4.5 meters high, engulfing the house in a terrifying swirl of fire. However, inside the living room, the temperature only increased by 3 degrees. The bioceramic mortar that Clara, Oliver, and Chen applied to the interwoven reeds worked in accordance with the more than 3,000-year-old tradition of the northern region. The high temperatures did not burn the wall. Instead, the extreme heat acted like a furnace, heating silica-rich wood ash, mineral salts, and animal fat into a hard, glass-like glaze that was impenetrable. A 15-inch thick layer of air was trapped inside the hollow reeds, preventing the heat from penetrating to the heavy pine logs below. The fire raged fiercely around the house for 5 minutes, consuming the surrounding bushes, and then, with nothing left to burn, it spread rapidly toward the rocky riverbed in the distance. When the smoke cleared, Clara opened the front door. The outer walls were scorching hot to the touch and blackened like charcoal, but completely intact. Not a single piece of wood in Samuel's house had been burned. Before anyone in the valley could comprehend Clara's miraculous survival, nature dealt a second, far more devastating blow. The wildfire had barely died down on the rocks by the river when the northern sky suddenly turned a terrifying, dark gray. The temperature didn't drop gradually over several hours, but plummeted like a heavy iron weight falling into a dry well. A mass of Arctic cold air, the fearsome northern blue wind, slammed into the valley with winds reaching 60 miles per hour. Within 90 minutes, the temperature plummeted to 45 degrees. The thermometer on Clara's porch dropped from 40 degrees above zero to 15 degrees below zero and continued to fall to nearly 35 degrees below zero as darkness enveloped the mountains. The sudden change caused a terrible disaster at Major Harrison's farm. Harrison's men had spent the past 2 hours pouring hundreds of gallons of well water onto the burning pine roof and wooden walls to extinguish the embers of the wildfire. The wooden roof structure was half scorched, its structural integrity severely compromised by the heat. When a frigid, sub-zero blast of Arctic air slammed into the damp, fragile house, millions of gallons of water seeping into the pine planks instantly froze into thick, heavy layers of ice. Within an hour, thousands of pounds of ice had accumulated on the damaged rafters. At 8 o'clock that evening, a terrifying sound echoed through the frozen valley. A series of sharp, cracking noises like cannon fire, followed by a deafening roar like thunder. Under the unbearable weight of the sudden ice sheet, the entire upper floor and heavy wooden roof of Major Harrison's military fort collapsed inward with tremendous force. Iron bolts snapped through the frozen pine, double plank walls split from foundation to eaves, crushing the fireplace, burying the firewood supply, and leaving the interior completely exposed to the freezing Arctic storm of minus 30 degrees Celsius. Harrison and his 4 shivering hired hands were lucky to escape the snow, standing alone on their boots with only the clothes on their backs, watching their $4,000 house turn into a frozen, crumbling tomb. 300 yards away, Gideon Sterling's luxurious wooden house was in no better condition. The sudden drop in temperature had caused the untreated green oak planks of the walls to shrink rapidly, peeling away the plaster between the planks. A bone-chilling wind swept through every room of his mansion. His massive iron fireplaces burned wood at an alarming rate, but the heat escaping through the cracks in the shrinking walls was so fast that his men couldn't keep up with shoveling coals into the furnaces. By midnight, the temperature inside Sterling's living room had dropped to 28 degrees. The water in the pitchers on his dining table had begun to freeze, and his firewood pile was half empty. Meanwhile, inside her dark, reed-covered wooden house, surrounded by her kiln, Clara Vance sat at the kitchen table under the light of a single oil lamp.
Outside, the wind howled at 65 miles an hour, blasting sharp ice crystals against her walls, with enough force to peel the paint from the wood. But inside, the thermometer hanging by the fireplace steadily showed 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Old Mr. Shadow lay fast asleep on the tattered rug near the hearth, his belly facing the gentle warmth. Oliver sat beside him, sketching sun-drenched meadows on a stone tablet with a piece of white chalk. Clara dipped her pen into the inkwell, opened her leather-bound notebook, and recorded her evening diary entry. November 14th. The wildfire is over. The exterior plaster has melted to rock. Cold air from the Arctic arrived at 6 p.m. Outdoor temperature, minus 34 degrees. Indoor temperature, 68 degrees. Burned wood, 3 small birch knots. She put down her pen, looked out the small window at the fierce, swirling white storm, and whispered softly to herself, "The wind knows everything." By the 4th night of the Arctic blizzard, Blackwood Valley no longer existed as a human settlement. The blizzard had wiped it from the face of the earth. Strong winds exceeding 70 miles per hour lashed down from the mountain passes, whipping 4-foot-thick layers of powdery snow into towering piles that buried fences, sheds, and roads. Temperatures had plummeted to dangerously low 40 degrees below zero. At that temperature, skin exposed to the air would freeze solid in less than 60 seconds. Breath would freeze before it could escape from the lips, and the cold was so biting that the wooden beams inside the cabins creaked and cracked like dry bones under hydraulic pressure. Down in the valley, the illusion of wealth in the frontier region had completely shattered. Inside Gideon Sterling's massive wooden mansion, the iron fireplaces stood motionless and empty. His men had burned through their entire 2-block supply of firewood in 36 hours to warm the rooms where the cold air seeped in through the ever-shrinking gaps in the walls. In desperation, Sterling chopped up the mahogany dining table, the carved oak chairs, and 3 wooden bookshelves for firewood. But to no avail. The cold air was pouring in faster than the fire could warm it. By midnight on Wednesday, the temperature inside Sterling's drawing room had dropped to 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Thick ice had formed on the wallpaper, his remaining coal tar had solidified into a thick, unburnable jelly, and Sterling himself sat huddled in a corner under 4 woolen blankets, his fingers white and numb, listening to the cries of the men suffering from the excruciating pain of frostbite. Less than half a mile away, Major Harrison and his 4 hired hands huddled in the corner of a drafty, uninsulated sheep shed, the only structure on his property undamaged when its ice-covered roof collapsed. Their legs were wrapped in filthy grain sacks, their faces pale, their ears blackened by hypothermia. They knew, frighteningly, that if they remained in that shed until dawn, none of them would wake. Only one light remained burning in the entire Blackwood Basin. On the eastern slope of the valley, a single steady wisp of pale grey smoke drifted gently into the cold sky. It rose from the stone chimney of the Vance farm. Standing in her dark, enclosed living room, Clara Vance was adding 2 small pieces of pine wood to the cast-iron stove. The stove door closed with a soft metallic click. The room was quiet, faintly scented with the sweet, fresh aroma of dried sweet grass, cedar resin, and hot tea. On the wall opposite the fireplace, the brass thermometer still showed 68 degrees, completely unchanged. The 15-inch thick armor, woven from reeds, fired to a rock-hard glaze, vitrified by forest fires, and sealed against the slightest air current with Chen's mineral mortar, was functioning perfectly. Millions of microscopic air pockets trapped within the hollow reed stalks acted as an impenetrable barrier. Mountain winds howled against the dark outer shell with the force of a sledgehammer, but the energy was dispersed into the outer glaze, unable to reach the hand-carved pine logs beneath. Oliver sat on the woven rug near the fireplace, carefully threading dried apples onto a string, while Old Shadow slept beside his feet, its tail gently tapping the floor whenever Clara walked past. Then, just after 1 o'clock in the morning, Old Shadow's ears suddenly perked up. The old hunting dog lifted its head, its dark eyes immediately fixed on the heavy oak door in front of it. A low growl escaped from deep within its throat. Clara froze. Amidst the deafening roar of the storm outside, she heard a sound that didn't belong to the storm. A faint, hurried banging against the wood beneath the door, followed by a sound like fingernails scratching on frozen wood. Oliver looked up, his eyes wide with fear. "Mom?" "Always follow your heart, Oliver," Clara whispered. She walked to the corner, picked up Samuel's double-barreled shotgun, and inspected the brass bullets under both triggers. She draped a thick woolen shawl over her shoulders, went to the door, and lifted the thick oak security bar from its iron bracket. She opened the door, but only managed to get about 15 centimeters ajar amidst the blinding white snowstorm. A cold wind from the Arctic immediately swept in, carrying fine snowflakes towards the entrance. But the sight that awaited her at the doorstep left Clara completely speechless. Gideon Sterling was kneeling on a pile of snow nearly 2 meters high outside her doorstep. The wealthy land speculator had now lost all his arrogance. His mink-lined coat was tattered and covered in ice. His high-heeled leather boots were cracked, and his face was as white as chalk from severe frostbite. His bare hands, bleeding from clinging to the ice as he crawled up the slope, weakly struck the wooden planks blocking her doorway. Behind Sterling, clinging to his coat, was Major Harrison, nearly unconscious. His head slumped on Sterling's shoulder, his breath ragged and intermittent. Behind them were 3 hired hands, huddled in the snow like dying cattle, sobbing uncontrollably from the bone-chilling cold. "Please, Mrs. Vance, have mercy," Sterling cried, his voice hoarse and weak from his frozen lips. He held out his blood-stained, frost-bitten hands to her, pleading desperately. "For God's sake, let us in. We're freezing to death." Clara stood on the dry, warm 68-degree doorstep, looking down at the man who had called her insane, who had tried to label her an unfit mother, who had tried to steal her son and burn down her house. She neither raised her gun nor stepped back to let them storm in. "You called this house a madman's fuel silo, Mr. Sterling," Clara said, her voice echoing amidst the howling blizzard with absolute clarity. "You've brought the law to my doorstep to take my son away because you want to steal my spring." Sterling sobbed uncontrollably, his hot tears freezing into icy droplets on his cheeks. "I was wrong. God, I was wrong. I'll give you anything you want. Just don't leave us here in the darkness."
Clara reached into her apron pocket. She pulled out the lawsuit Sterling had filed with the local judge, a document requesting that she be declared insane and that her land be confiscated. Beside it, she held a brand new handwritten waiver of prosecution form she had prepared weeks earlier, along with a small inkwell she kept warm in her sweater and a steel-tipped pen. She placed a flat cedar board on Sterling's bleeding knee and pressed the pen into his stiff, numb fingers. "Sign the document relinquishing ownership, Mr. Sterling," Clara commanded gently. "Relinquish all claims, all mortgages, and all lawsuits against this farm and spring, right now, on the ice." Sterling didn't hesitate for a second. With trembling, numb hands, he hastily scribbled his name at the bottom of the page, then dropped the pen into the snow as soon as he finished the last word. Clara picked up the signed paper, checked the signature under the lantern light, then carefully folded it and put it in her apron pocket. Then she lowered her gun, stepped back from the doorway, and opened the door wide for the men who were shivering from the cold. "Oliver?" Clara whispered over her shoulder as she helped carry the semi-conscious Major Harrison through the door. "Put the large kettle on the stove and get the dry wool blankets. We have a visitor." The snowstorm finally subsided on the morning of December 20th. When the sun finally peeked through the gray clouds for the first time in 6 days, it revealed Blackwood Valley, completely transformed by the storm. The sky was a pale, dazzling blue, the air was eerily still, and the valley floor was buried under nearly 1.5 meters of snow, eroded by the wind and piled up to 3 meters high on the western slopes. Throughout the basin, the price of human arrogance was being silently calculated. More than 80% of traditional timber farms had suffered severe damage. Roofs collapsed under the weight of the ice, barns were blown away, and half the livestock in the valley below were frozen under piles of ice. However, on the eastern edge of the basin, the houses perched on the rocky outcrop remain intact. Inside Clara Vance's house, 11 people awoke to the warm morning light streaming through the glass windows. Gideon Sterling, Major Harrison, and their hired hands gathered around the kitchen table, drinking hot chicory coffee and eating warm bowls of oatmeal prepared by Clara and young Oliver. None of them retained the arrogance they had displayed in the months before arriving in this valley. Their frostbitten skin was treated with turpentine ointment provided by old Mr. Chen. Their numb fingers were wrapped in clean linen, and their eyes held the quiet, humble look of men who had faced the abyss of winter and survived only through the kindness of others. Major Harrison stepped outside shortly after breakfast, his boots crunching on the frozen snow. He stood under the eaves of Clara's north wall, gazing up at the hardened black plaster. He held out his gloved hand and pressed his palm against the surface. The wall was as hard as rock, as smooth as the slate where the forest fire had heated it, completely impervious to the sub-zero wind that still rustled through the high mountain slopes. Old Mr. Chen walked up the path from the cattle shed, carrying a bundle of dry cedar wood. Harrison turned to the elderly Asian worker, took off his leather gloves, and extended his hand. "I spent 20 years studying military engineering, Mr. Chen," Major Harrison said, his voice low, devoid of any of his former pride. "I used to think 2-inch thick pine planks and iron bolts were the ultimate defense against this country. I was foolish. You and Mrs. Vance built a fort from moss and ash, and it saved 11 lives when my $4,000 house became a tomb." Old Man Tran looked at the retired officer's outstretched hand, then grasped it with a firm, warm hold. "Mountains pay no heed to military treatises, Major," Tran replied softly. "Wood withstands the wind until it breaks. Reeds yield to the wind, holding on to their breath and turning it to their advantage. That is not our wisdom. That is 3,000 years of listening to Mother Earth." That afternoon, Gideon Sterling left Vance Farm on a sled brought by the search teams from town. His hands were heavily bandaged, his face was scarred from frostbite, and he didn't glance back at the house as the sled descended the slope. He had kept the promise he had made at Clara's doorstep. Within 2 months, Sterling had sold his shares in the sawmill, forgave his land mortgages, and left Montana Territory forever, his name becoming a story recounted by merchants in the capital. When spring finally returned to Blackwood Valley in May 1890, the snow melted on the tall meadows, and the freshwater stream on Clara's land gushed forth, clear, cool, and abundant as always. But the valley did not return to its former state. When the new settlers arrived that summer to rebuild their devastated lands, they didn't go to the sawmill to buy thin pine planks. Instead, they rode up the long hill to Clara Vance's farm. They came not to mock, but to learn. They stood in her yard with notebooks and tape measures, asking about the best time to harvest linden trees, the precise ratio of ash to mineral salts, and how to properly weave planks from reeds. Clara refused no one. Along with Mr. Chen and Oliver, she taught every family in the basin how to harvest wild linden trees from the Black Swamp, how to make animal fat mortar, and how to build houses that would withstand the winter rather than fight it. Mr. Chen was no longer left alone in his swamp shelter. He became the most respected builder in the region, sought after by ranchers from all 3 counties. Years passed on the Montana frontier. Oliver grew into a strong, resourceful young man, adept at reading clouds, swamp mud, and wind direction, just as his mother and Chen had taught him. Old Shadow spent his final years sleeping in the sun beside the north wall he had faithfully guarded throughout the great storm. The nickname Swamp Widow gradually faded from the local language, remembered only as a shameful relic of the town's past ignorance. In land surveys, historical maps, and stories passed down through generations of herders in the valley, the farm on the eastern slope was recorded under a new, permanent name, Reed Grass Fortress. The story of Clara Vance is not simply about swamp algae, volcanic ash, or sub-zero temperatures. It is a testament to an enduring truth on the frontier, that nature never succumbs to human arrogance, and that the strongest defense isn't always the strongest looking. Sometimes, wisdom comes under the guise of the ordinary, something quietly blossoming in the mud of a forgotten swamp. And when the harsh winter arrives to deliver its final judgment, the only witness whose opinion truly matters is the storm.